Good evening. We'll start the program here in about 1 minute. Good evening. I'm Mike Perry. I'm the Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome you to a rather interesting talk, one trying to expand our knowledge of the Civil War and the role of African-American troops and West Point graduates in forming the first African-American regiment of the war. I'm pleased to introduce Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. Ben is a native of Quincy, Florida, and a 1980 graduate of West Point. During his military career, he served as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army until his retirement in 2018. His service included assignments with the 101st Airborne Division, several overseas tours in Germany, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Belgium, and various staff positions within 18th Airborne Corps, the Army Staff, and the Joint Staff. His last assignment was Commanding General, U.S. Army Europe. He now holds the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He is a proud father of Magdalene Rodriguez and Ben Hodges, and grandfather to Amelia, Abraham, and Jet. Our second panelist is Colonel retired Chris Allen. Chris was born into the Army at Marion, Alabama, to a career infantry officer. Commissioned to the infantry from West Point in 1980, he migrated, I like that term, migrated, to the Special Forces in 1985 and served in uniform until 2009. He last departed Afghanistan as a Department of the Army civilian in 2017 to swim into the history of South Carolina's low country. Gentlemen, the floor is now yours.
Mike, thanks very much. I appreciate you and the foundation hosting events like this. Obviously for me, it's a thrill and an honor to get to do this with my classmate and friend of 45 years, Chris Allen, who lives in Beaufort. Chris infected me with this story about the 1st South Carolina Volunteers of African Descent and the historical significance of the area around Beaufort as well. Want to make it clear, of course, you'll spot it immediately. Neither Chris or I are professional historians. We're just two old guys who fell in love with a story of really brave, courageous men who demonstrated moral and physical courage, and they're part of our history, part of the Army's history, and part of American history. Our purpose is to inspire others to help take this story forward, fill in the gaps, and perhaps find a way to use it to teach and also to serve as an example of dignity and courage. At the end of this, we'll have a to-do list for the audience. There's things, some suggestions we have that we think will be useful. But I also need to tell you, again, we're not professional historians. Most of our research relied on sources that were written by whites during the time of the Civil War or afterwards. So it was through a white perspective. I also have to tell you, it was very uncomfortable confronting the history of this time. And also, frankly, it was uncomfortable dealing with the terminology. And so for historians, the challenges of how do you refer to people, their legal status, is hard. And so this was part of our learning experience as well. Most of you should have been able to get the read ahead, which includes the bibliography, a timeline, maps, and a description of the key actors or players in this story. If not, Mike said he will be sure to send them out to everybody that may have registered here in the last couple of days. Okay, Chris, over to you, brother.
Okay, Benny. Hopefully everyone can see the slides right now, and we'll get started. So, about a decade ago, my complete...
I need the screens, share your slides again.
Sorry, okay, sure. Gotcha, I understand. second. Let me get to this presentation mode. There we go. Should be good now. All right, here we go. About a decade ago, my complete knowledge of African-American service in the Civil War was derived from the 1989 movie Glory, which left me with a mistaken impression that the 54th Massachusetts were the groundbreaking pioneers. Their 1863 story exposed me to some local history in the low country of South Carolina, but I had difficulty reconciling time and geography. As a lay historian, I was drawn into the story of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers of African Descent, an obscure unit whose story answers these two questions. The 1st South, that's what they called themselves, the 1st South. The 1st South was formed almost a year before the more famous 54th. My introspection educated me on what a stark and ugly time this portion of American history contains. Expecting to find some Blacks in our pre-Civil War Army, I was sobered when Molly Bonpane discovered that Blacks, enslaved and free, were precluded by law, that was the Militia Act of 1792, from armed service. Anyone embracing the flag of the Confederacy should do so with knowledge of its philosophic cornerstone. This policy makes it hard to reconcile the fact that the Civil War's 1st Black Regiment, the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, offered their service to the Confederacy from May of 1861. Former Speaker of the House and Secretary of the Treasury Howell Cobb might have framed the issue for our story most concisely. The arming of free Blacks was almost as controversial in the North as it was in the South. The arming of enslaved Blacks, even more so, as it was argued that they lacked the intellect to comprehend orders. They had been conditioned too docile to confront battlefield stresses, and they would be too vengeful against whites to conduct themselves under military discipline. All of those were argued at the same time.
Chris, let me just point out, Alexander Stephens there, of course, the Georgia state legislature today is working to replace the statue of Stephens that stands in Statuary Hall in the US Capitol. Each state is able to put 2 statues there that contributed to the state's development. And unbelievably, even today in 2021, Stephens' statue still stands there. But I anticipate that the Georgia State Legislature will replace it with another figure soon.
Thank you, Benny. I introduced Mr. Cobb to the 1st South Carolina Volunteers of African Descent, organized in Beaufort District and employed in combat on the Confederacy's Atlantic coast as early as 5 August 1862. He had been willing to consider, or had he been willing to consider evidence available in 1862, perhaps he would have realized the Confederacy was built on a false cornerstone. These are the only actual 2 photographs of the 1st South that I know of, and I give a word of caution on the photo that was a part of the website teaser for this talk. That photo was taken in Beaufort about May of 1864, but it depicts the 29th Connecticut Volunteers colored. So I just want to make sure that nobody uses that photo as a representation of the 1st South, as magnificent as that photo is. So we say 1862, that is impossible, as that is the year before Glory. Beaufort, South Carolina, again impossible, as the first ordinance of secession was drafted in Beaufort, so how could this be a Union town? Allow me to set the stage. Remember that the earliest Union strategic thought hinged upon economically isolating Confederate states through blockade. This briefed well, but the Union Navy began implementing this strategy with about 35 ships, few of which were suited to the task. Of the few ships employed, time on station was reduced by transit time between home port and operational areas. And by the summer of 1861, it became clear that forward operating bases were required. Draw your attention to the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. I also draw your attention to the second deepest natural harbor on the east coast of the United States. That's Port Royal, South Carolina. This 1861 chart depicts our area in more detail. The eastern portion of Beaufort District is comprised of about 64 islands. Note the town of Beaufort and Camp Saxton are on Port Royal Island, though the Union called Hilton Head and the general area of the entire enclave Port Royal. Just off the chart in the south is Fort McAllister, where William Tecumseh Sherman would terminate his march to the sea in December of 1864. On 29 October of 1861, 75 ships with a Navy Army task force, that's the Army 10th Corps with about 12,000 troops, the largest American fleet assembled until World War II, departed Hampton Roads. Note in the center map, note Perry Island. I suspect the Yankees could not understand the thick Southern accent down here. This is Paris Island, site of today's Marine Corps recruit depot. For anyone who doubts the value of a 4-year Naval Academy education, the tactics depicted on this graphic should put your mind at ease. After long study, Admiral DuPont detached 17 ships of the line from the transports and had them sail in a circle. Seriously, this was all, this truly was a Navy-led affair, the Army supporting, the Navy did the work. On the way in, 151 large guns between 9-inch and 11 inches would bear on the smaller Confederate fort of Fort Beauregard. And on the way out, the guns would bear upon Fort Walker. Skipping a few details, by 2 p.m., the Confederates were pummeled into evacuation. And by 4 p.m., Union forces were landing and were occupying both Confederate forts. Again, skipping a few details, this chart approximates the extent of the Union enclave in December of 1861. The boundaries ebbed and flowed little over the next 4 years. I find the 5-mile concentric rings to be helpful. Just for example, the signal towers between the town of Beaufort and 10th Corps headquarters on Hilton Head Island was about 14 miles. It's roughly 25 miles to Savannah and 50 miles to Charleston. Note that Tybee Island was Union occupied, leveraging the 11 April 1862 capture of Fort Pulaski on Cockspur Island. In short, the expedition's primary objectives, the establishment of a deep water naval base, had been attained. What was never considered in the plan was that every single white citizen would evacuate to the Confederate mainland.
Chris, this was one of the biggest surprises for me as we were doing our research. When you started talking about this regiment in the United States Army that was formed in Beaufort, South Carolina, I couldn't understand how could that possibly be. I mean, Beaufort obviously sits there right between Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. And of course, Beaufort was the heart of the secession movement in South Carolina. So how could that be? And then, of course, you explained to me this whole amphibious operation that our great Navy conducted, and that we were able to establish an enclave on the South Carolina coast on one of the best natural harbors on all of the Atlantic seaboard of the United States. And it was there for almost the duration of the war. What a significant strategic impact that's going to have, I think, that we'll explain as we go along here.
Yeah, Benny, if I was taught that at West Point, I certainly didn't remember it. It wasn't on my screen. So anyway, like we said, so every single white citizen evacuated this area and leaving us with one of the earliest civil affairs case studies. Certain that their Confederate Army would make short work of this insolent Yankee incursion, about 10,000 enslaved human beings were temporarily abandoned. Under Union occupation, these 10,000 were neither free nor enslaved. They were legally confiscated Confederate property. Though we know how the movie ends, in 1861 and 1862, the outcome of the war and their fate were far from certain. Literally overnight, the Union Army of Occupation became responsible for their care and feeding. And while the 10th Corps commander shouted to Washington, D.C. for help, over the next 4 months, Captain Rufus Saxton, became intimately familiar with the plight of the contraband. Until February of 1862, when it was determined that the Department of Treasury was responsible for the management of all confiscated Confederate property. Edward Pierce arrived to manage lands, crops, homes, and contraband. A public-private partnership between Treasury and the Northern Abolitionist Societies was conceived to conduct the Port Royal experiment, later framed as the rehearsal for Reconstruction. In 1862, Pierce sought data to answer these two elemental questions. It literally was an experiment that he was going into. They didn't know the answer. Union Port Royal became the Department of the South's major logistics hub. Those of us who have a little familiarity with Vietnam think Cam Ranh Bay as the major logistics base. From this enclave, the Navy's South Atlantic Blockading Squadron conducted its operations. For example, in January of 1863, at least 9 ironclads would have postured off the pier that you can see right there for the impending siege of Charleston. And the Department of the South, that was responsible for South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, conducted operations as far south as St. Augustine and as far north as Charleston. On 31 March of 1862, Major General David Hunter assumed command of the Department of the South. Clearly, Hunter arrived with the thought of forming a black regiment already in mind. He immediately consulted with informal contraband leaders to determine if, given the opportunity, they would be willing to serve the Union under arms. On the 4th of April, Hunter signed a formal request for uniforms and equipment required to form a black regiment. By 10 April, 150 able-bodied contraband had committed to Hunter's proposition. By 7 May, several volunteer Union NCOs were commissioned to be regimental cadre, and on 8 May of 1862, recruitment and enlistment were initiated. Again, skipping a few details, the regiment was imperfectly formed, but formed nonetheless.
Chris, you know, one other thing about Hilton Head and this logistics hub, not only was it essential to sustaining the U.S. Navy's blockade of much of the Confederate coastline and key harbors, but when you explained this to me, it put my whole understanding of Sherman's march to the sea 3 years later in a completely different context. I mean, since I was a kid, I grew up in North Florida and South Georgia. I always heard about Sherman's March to the Sea. But now I realize the operational design was much more sophisticated than I had imagined. When he left Atlanta in the fall of 1864, he was headed to this gigantic logistics base. And that, I mean, he was marching to the food. And if you think about the design, and I think most historians agree that Sherman's march and the ultimate capture of Savannah really sealed the fate of the Confederacy. Think about the strategic impact of those black soldiers that protected this whole enclave for almost 3 years, the strategic effect of soldiers that when they were formed, we didn't even know if they would be able to fight, but they had a strategic impact that enabled victory in the Civil War.
Yeah, that's true, Dave. Most of us know that border states were on the edge about any issue associated with slavery. On the 5th of June, Kentucky's Representative Wycliffe sent a congressional inquiry on press reports that the Lincoln administration was arming fugitive slaves. Hunter's response is important as it depicts the status of the regiment being formed at about its six-week mark. Hunter clearly underscores from where his authority to form an armed regiment in contravention to the Militia Act of 1792 was derived. Neither Lincoln nor the War Department ever challenged this authority to form, but neither did they find it essential that these soldiers be paid. Probably most importantly, Hunter's response received wide and raucous dissemination throughout the legislative branch. They had read it multiple times there to great uproars, where it resonated until 3 weeks later, the legal basis for blacks to serve under arms was indelibly established as law by the Militia Act of 1862. To supplement Hunter's 23 June congressional response, though not formally mustered, this sketch provides visual evidence of a functioning black regiment under federal officer leadership, in uniform and under arms on 25 June of 1862. 5 days after the regiment's first review, Brigadier General, remember Captain, Brigadier General Rufus Saxton returned to Port Royal as the military governor of the Department of the South. Departing Beaufort for an inspection on multiple coastal sites, he was accompanied by Company A, which was tasked to clear Confederate Company D of the 3rd Georgia Cavalry Battalion from the tentative Union enclave on St. Simon's Island, Georgia. Confederate Captain William Hazard recorded his August experience. "If you wish to know hell before your time, go to St. Simon's and be hunted 10 days by Negroes." Of course, he did not use the Negro word. This was the first operational deployment of a black Union Army element in combat. And remember, it's without pay. As it happens, this deployment also marked Company A as the thin green line of continuity. As on 9 August, Major General Hunter despaired of the War Department's ambiguity towards his regiment, neither disapproval nor endorsement beyond the uniforms and equipment they sent, and he ordered the remainder of the regiment to be disbanded until such time as the War Department committed to a position on arming blacks. He gave up too soon. On 25 August, Secretary of War Stanton, about coincident with the day Lincoln made his emancipation decision, signed the first order specifically authorizing the formation and pay of up to 5,000 blacks into a Union regiment at Port Royal. In October, Brigadier General Saxton recalled Captain Trowbridge and Company A from St. Simon's to serve as the nucleus of the First South to be reformed at Camp Saxton. By the way, that's the ship that the boat that they sailed down there to bend to Ford. So this sketch captures Brigadier General Saxton administering the second oath of enlistment to Company A on 15 October 1862.
Chris, you mentioned the thin line. And this is a common thing in amongst many of the regiments of the U.S. Army today, that as our Army grew in time of war and then contracted again, there was always a strong desire to protect, maintain lineage of different regiments. And so interesting that A Company of the First South was that thin line of continuity, which I think bolsters our argument that it was this regiment that is the beginning of the continuous service of African-American soldiers in the United States Army.
It's amazing, Benny. They were pioneers. It wasn't perfect and they had bumps and bruises, but again, there was no playbook. They were making it up as they went along. And it all gets to this little group of men that David Hunter started in May. It was those original 150 or so that comprised this unit. They were the heart of the regiment. So. And here's a few images of the First South's new home at Camp Saxton, 2 miles south of the town of Beaufort, grounds of today's U.S. Naval Hospital, Beaufort. You can see it's the former Smith's plantation. We can talk more about that later if we wish. Aside from being another of the earliest combat operations of a Union Army black element, the incident depicted here is important because Lieutenant Colonel Oliver Beard was not an abolitionist and was decidedly not a supporter of Hunter's black experiment. In fact, he tended towards the worst of the white stereotypes, which made Lieutenant Colonel Beard's glowing endorsement of the First South's disciplined performance under fire all the more potent in advancing the case for expanded Black armed service in the fall of 1862. This engraving captures an obscure piece of American poetry that belongs to the state of South Carolina and to the United States Army. On the night of the 31st of December of 1862, the First South retired as contraband property. On the morning of the 1st of January of 1863, under the live oaks of Camp Saxon, Brigadier General Saxton hosted a ceremony for the first public invocation of the enacted Emancipation Proclamation, where serving U.S. Army soldiers were transformed to be henceforth and forever free. Now, I'm sure most of us attending this probably have a military background, and most of us have endured the many canned ceremonies, but this is one where Regimental Commander Colonel Thomas W. Higginson recalled an unscripted interruption to the proceedings. And let me just, here's what he had to say. I took and waved the flag, which now for the first time meant anything to these poor people. There suddenly arose a strong male voice into which two women's voices instantly blended, singing as if by an impulse that could no more be repressed than the morning note of the song sparrow. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. I never saw anything so electric. It made all other words cheap. It seemed the choked voice of a race at last unloosed. After the war, the regimental colors found their way to West Point. About 1929, an Army board determined the colors to have no historical value. These and many other USCT colors were destroyed. In 1988, the West Point Museum discovered the engraved brass artifacts from the flagstaff of the 1st South Carolina Regimental Colors, where they are currently on display. You heard the voice of Colonel Higginson earlier. This is what he later said of the two special non-commissioned officers depicted on the speaker's platform in the Emancipation engraving. I'll give you a second to read those. If there should ever be a Black monarchy in South Carolina, he will be its king. That is my favorite NCOER bullet of all time. Sergeant Rivers told a public gathering in Beaufort, now we soldiers are men the first time in our lives. Now we can look our old masters in the face. They used to sell us and whip us, and we did not dare say one word. Now we ain't afraid. If they meet us, to run the bayonet through them. Immediately after the 1 January ceremony, the 1st South conducted riverine operations on the St. Mary's River in January, followed by the St. Johns River in February and the occupation of Confederate Jacksonville through the end of March of 1863. Major General Hunter, back in command of the Department of the South for a second time, privately reported on the regiment's performance in combat to President Lincoln.
So, Chris, whenever we talk about Prince Rivers, I always have this visual in my head of Morgan Freeman, from Glory. That's the kind of almost sort of a royal, distinguished person that Prince Rivers was. So that picture in my head is of Morgan Freeman from Glory.
I see the exact same thing, Ben, and you could do worse, couldn't you? So here's Lincoln's response to General Hunter's report on their performance down in Jacksonville. And this is the 1st of April of 1863, setting the tone for what was about to come. And this is where our story joins the better known part of history. In May of 1863, the Bureau of United States Colored Troops was established, and Matthew, Morgan, and Denzel boarded a ship in Boston en route to the Union enclave at Port Royal. In the town of Beaufort, on the path to glory, the 54th Colonel Shaw was hosted by the 1st South's Colonel Higginson. There was never a Gettysburg moment when the fate of the war hinged upon the heroism of the 1st South. Rather, it was their competent performance in 1862, in contrast to the expectations of abject failure that established the possibilities of those who followed in 1863. Had the 1st South and the other 5 1862 Black regiments faltered in 1862, the USCT and the 54th might not have had a chance to form in 1863. By war's end, 187,000 Blacks served in Union Blue. Instead of being a more visible 1st Regiment of the USCT, Hunter's pioneering regiment, the 1st South, was reflagged as the 33rd USCT in 1864. Regimental operations never ranged outside of the backwater of the Department of the South, so they were pretty doggone obscure in history. And I'm sure everyone here remembers Captain Trowbridge. On the 9th of February, 1866, Lieutenant Colonel Trowbridge formed the 1st South for the regiment's inactivation ceremony at Battery Wagner, where the 54th Massachusetts earned their glory. We almost forgive his lack of knowledge of Black service in our American Revolution, but I share a few words from his address. The hour is at hand when we must separate forever, and nothing can ever take from us the pride we feel when we look back upon the history of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, the 1st Black regiment that ever bore arms in the defense of freedom on the continent of America. It seems fitting to me that the last hours of our existence as a regiment should be passed amidst the unmarked graves of your comrades at Fort Wagner. Near you rest the bones of Colonel Shaw, buried by an enemy's hand in the same grave with his Black soldiers who fell at his side. Now let us fast forward. Aside from the previously mentioned West Point display, these 3 placards are the only reminders of the 1st South's place in American Army history. 2 of them can only be seen if you have a DOD ID card allowing you entrance into the housing area at the U.S. Naval Hospital of Beaufort. And now for the test. You know there had to be a test at the end. Depending on the weight that one puts on formal muster dates, for example, the reformed Louisiana Native Guard was formally mustered on the 27th of September of 1862. The 1st South, whose ranks were composed exclusively of formerly enslaved men, which differentiates them from other 1862 regiments, may or may not have claim to being the Union Army's 1st Black regiment. It all depends on how much weight you put on the mark of them reaching 830 people. So they didn't reach that until January of 1863. But with little doubt, the continuous Black service our Army enjoys today started on 8 May of 1862. Of equal importance, David Hunter's bold, unpopular, and against the grain actions of April, May, June 1862 shaped legislative debates which led to the Militia Act of 1862 and animated cabinet debates in the summer of 1862 that germinated into the Emancipation Proclamation. And now an epilogue. Company A was never paid for their first 5 months of Army service. Robert Sutton seems to have dropped off the radar. He is a worthy loose thread who merits more pulling. As for Sergeant Prince Rivers, what an American story. Born into slavery, self-emancipated, volunteered to fight for the liberty of others without pay, then becoming a most respected senior non-commissioned officer in the United States Army. You're looking at the only known photograph of Prince. I'd like to find more. This was extracted from when he was a representative to the 1868 South Carolina State Legislature, charged with drafting a new South Carolina State Constitution consistent with preservation of the US Constitution. You can see that in the bottom left there, he is circled, and there's the blow up of his photo in the center bottom. Prince matriculated to be a judge, which became his downfall with the rise of Jim Crow. In the aftermath of the Hamburg, South Carolina massacre of 1876, where white rifle club members murdered a unit of lawfully employed South Carolina state militia, of course they were black then, Prince would be the trial judge, which was intolerable for Wade Hampton's red shirts who had yet to abandon, remember the Confederate cornerstone? They still held that to be true. Unchecked white terrorism made it impossible for Prince to serve on the judicial bench. The rise of ugly Jim Crow saw the demise of magnificent Prince Rivers. His last days were spent driving a coach for an Aiken hotel, the same job he performed while he was enslaved. Prince died of Bright's disease and was buried in segregated Randolph Cemetery in Columbia, South Carolina. His grave remains unmarked. Benny, I think that's there's my summary in a can.
Yeah. So Chris, thank you. What a powerful, anybody that's listening that doesn't feel the passion and get infected with this story like I did from you, doesn't have a heart in their chest. What we did want to provide for everybody is a list of some suggested things that what should come next. Chris and I and Becky spent a long, hot afternoon at that cemetery there in Columbia, South Carolina, looking for a grave that we could confirm was the unmarked grave of Color Sergeant Prince Rivers. Could not find it. This is something that we would like to get help to confirm the location, and then also make sure that there is an appropriate Veterans Administration marker certifying his service as a U.S. Army veteran of the American Civil War. We'd like to find out more about what happened to the colors of the 1st South, but also the 33rd USCT regimental colors, but the 1st South was redesignated as the 33rd. We think that the museum at West Point, which thankfully had preserved the metal rings from the flagstaffs, perhaps that display could be upgraded and provide more context about the significance of the 1st South. This is an American story, but I think the state of South Carolina could do some specific things, especially if the South Carolina congressional delegation puts their shoulder to the wheel. There ought to be a special day, at least in South Carolina, for the 1st South, commemorating their service and showing that not everybody in South Carolina during the Civil War was a traitor, but that South Carolina had heroes too. I think a monument would be appropriate, or at least move those signs that Chris showed earlier to a place where everybody can see them and they're not off the beaten path. And certainly relevant aspects of this story could be turned into case studies for leadership development, or in something also that the university and high school system in South Carolina could incorporate. And I do hope that when the International African American Museum opens up in Charleston later this year, they're on the former Gadsden Wharf in Charleston, maybe that's a place also for some exhibit about the 1st South. I mentioned at the beginning that the state of Georgia, that the state legislature is looking for a replacement for the statue of Alexander Stephens, which stands in today's Statuary Hall, the US Capitol. So there are plenty of other ideas out there, but I think that people, if you're infected with this the way that we were, you'll look for ways to want to do something. Let me close And by the way, I know a lot of my friends out there know about my rock collection. Yes, of course, I do have a Prince Rivers rock that Chris and I picked up there at the site of Camp Saxon, but please don't report me to any official historians. Let me close with this. This was a quote from Colonel Higginson in his book called Black Soldiers in Blue Uniforms. Till the blacks were armed, there was no guarantee of their freedom. It was their demeanor under arms that shamed the nation into recognizing them as men. Mike, back to you.
Got some questions? If anybody else wants to submit a question, please go to the question and answer icon and place them there. First one from Ms. Gilmero. I'm killing your name, sorry. History has not been kind to Thomas Wentworth Higginson as a military officer. Did you stumble upon him in your research, and what's your opinion of him?
Benny, I'll start, and you can. But I tell you, yeah, I think so. So this is a case where, again, as West Point cadets, go to Ranger School, Special Forces, you're looking for guys who can do push-ups, pull-ups, stab bayonets, shoot straight, etc. I think Colonel Higginson was an example to me of a different kind of leadership, a different kind of leader who has his place in the Army. He was more cerebral, he was the editor for the Atlantic magazine, close friend and mentor of Emily Dickinson. And you saw, people that saw the read ahead saw that he was really even an abolitionist before the war. I think he is you wouldn't find a Ranger tab on him, but I think anybody, any senior leader in the United States Army would say, I want that man to be a part of my staff so that he can impart his thinking into the culture of my command. I admire him in a way that I was not trained to admire people like that, but I admire him greatly at this stage of my life. Benny, any comments?
Only that I was impressed with his moral courage and willingness. And when you read his diary and biography of the story about the regiment, how he grew. I mean, I think he started off, as an abolitionist, and then he grew beyond an idealistic thing to really respecting and appreciating these soldiers with whom he was serving.
This question is from Don. He says, my great-great-grandfather, Captain John D. Terry, was an officer with the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers, later the 35th U.S. Colored Troops, and also worked under General Saxton at the Freedmen Bureau. Do you have any information on how the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers fit into this time period?
Yeah, so as Ben said to start this with, we are not professional historians, and heck, my small scope of learning about the 1st South Carolina it has got me about super saturated here. I did learn a lot. It's like anything in history. If you were in Dubuque, Iowa, you would think that, and you were studying history there, you would think that all history comes from there. Even that's so. I did trip across very early in the war where the Union also established the enclave up at New Bern. I do have some books on that, but I just haven't gotten into that, in that it gets outside of the limit of my scope right here, because I was looking for the origins of where really I was looking for the origins. Where did it first start? Where blacks started becoming a part of the Army, and so that came a little bit later, and so it's a little bit out of my horizon. Benny, have you done any work in North Carolina?
Yeah, two things. First of all, Molly Bompane, who is the absolute best archivist I've ever met in my life, she turned up. She was trying to help us find the colors of the 33rd USCT, and she found a picture of the colors of the 35th USCT, which are in fact preserved and in either the Army Museum Support Center in Alexandria, Belvoir, or at a depot where these kind of Army memorabilia are stored. I just don't remember which one of it. Maybe it's Anniston or something like that.
Anniston.
Okay, so at least the colors of the 35th have been preserved and are being properly stored. The other thing is, if you didn't get the read ahead package, Mike will get it out to you. It lists the most of the sources that Chris and I used, and there are quite a few books about U.S. colored troops or Black soldiers, different histories that were written at different times that I would point you towards.
I have a question. Where did you find most of your resources?
So it's again, the local history here. I would say that prompted my interest in the story from here, and then of course from there, I went on and I read a bunch of stuff. So the First South Carolina Volunteers of African Descent, they're mentioned a lot. It kind of obscurely and sometimes incorrectly they're mentioned, but the vast majority of published works focus on the 1863 and beyond period. And so I found most of the sources, the published works that I had, insufficient on the 1862 origins of this stuff. And so where I ended up getting the vast majority of my stuff is from some of the original source documents of looking at some of the school teachers, like Laura Town, who was a school teacher at the Penn Center as part of the Port Royal experiment. Seth Rogers, who was the surgeon, he came in right before Christmas of 1862. I found those Edward Pierce, those first person narratives, I found them to be significantly better than most of the published works, because when my topic was 1862, and so I really found those to be of great insight.
Who holds that material?
And I was just going to say my base document for this is the work by our local historians here, Dr. Larry Rowland, who's become a mentor to me, and Dr. Steve Wise, who is out at the Paris Island Museum. Their works that they have done for local history here have really given me the foundation for me to go out and look at all these specific little, with specific questions, informed questions to go into these first person sources. I could really start pulling out more data now that I was armed with their knowledge.
Number of questions has exploded here. This is from Jeffrey. Did these soldiers receive pensions or any benefits after the war?
They did. My lovely girlfriend Becky has done a bunch of research into the archives, at various stuff, and she can find periodic stuff. The hard part, of course, is you get a lot of 33rd, and you forget the First South part. And so, like I say, they are there. The records are there. The Heritage Library on Hilton Head has done a great amount of work on this stuff, except for, it's funny, they've done a publication, but it captures everybody except for the 33rd on there. So there's a lot of data that needs to be pulled up there, but it is there. And so it's funny, my knowledge of this, I almost peak out with the Prince River story. And so again, all the loose threads after the war, I still have a lot of learning to do about what happened to these guys and how they fared when they went into Reconstruction and Jim Crow.
This is from Catherine. Is the Confederate Relic and Military History Museum involved in honoring the site?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know of that. I'll just do a quick mention. One of the other special places here in Beaufort that gets to that question In April of 1863, Abraham Lincoln personally approved the purchase of a place called Polly's Orchard, and it became the Beaufort National Cemetery. So it's roughly a year older than Arlington, but it is one of the few places here in the Deep South where you can find white soldiers and black soldiers buried side by side. And there is a section in that cemetery for some of the Confederates who died, and they are buried in the same cemetery. So it really is a special place. Didn't answer the question particularly, but that's just something that I think you might find of interest.
This is a question from Bob. First, he says, "Thank you for your presentation. I'm a retired African-American U.S. Army colonel, and this is something I knew nothing about. Were soldiers from the 1st South Carolina allowed to join with the black units that patrolled the American West? Do you know what happened to them after the war, or some of the soldiers after the war?"
Great question. Great question. So you're giving me, it's another research topic, is how was the baton passed on? Because I think, frankly, to my knowledge, the 1st South eclipsed during the Civil War. After, so 1864, they did some combat operations, Battle of Honey Hill, some stuff down in Florida. They were part of the occupying force of Savannah after Sherman got there. They occupied Charleston, and then they were up in some of the, they had to occupy the rest of South Carolina after the war. So they did a lot of occupation work here. But once they were inactivated in 1866, I literally know absolutely nothing about if any of them were able to, I just don't know anything about how the baton was passed off between USCT and passed on to the black soldiers, the Buffalo soldiers, et cetera. I don't know how that connectivity happened, and it's something I would love to learn about.
All right, so many here, I'm trying to sort out. This question is from Clint. About 1,000 contraband slaves were taken after the Northern ships took over Port Royal. 150 blacks were chosen to be part of the 1st Carolina. Do you know what happened to the other slaves that were part of that group?
Yeah, and I just want to make sure I got it right. When the Union got here, you saw those 64 islands, that enclave. There were roughly 10,000 slaves there inside of that enclave. And of course, that 10,000, that was the original piece. Of course, you got 10s, 20s, 100s coming in every week to expand the Union enclave. And then, of course, and I tease the Navy, but they were the ones who, while the Union Army was sitting on this enclave, the Navy was going up and down the coast. And of course, slaves would self-emancipate to the Navy, to the small gunboats, and the Navy would bring the males of that, many of which raised their hands and said, "Yes, and now that I know about this, I would like to be a part of that." But so it was far more than the 1,000. Maybe I didn't understand the question directly, but it was 10,000 slaves, enslaved people, of which, I don't know, I'm going to pick a number, about maybe 2,500 of them perhaps were males of military age. And then of course that expanded up and down the coast from St. Augustine, Jacksonville, Fernandina, St. Simons, et cetera. And so all those people, that's why it's cool looking at the records, because you can see where some of these, how the 1st South expanded with its population from all those many different places.
This is a sort of combined question. The movie Glory and some other sources have indicated some unflattering depiction of black troops from Beaufort ravaging villages. Did you see any documentation of this?
Yeah. So I think, frankly, I think that is more a reflection of the commander of that, because and one of as much as I love the movie Glory, and no offense to Denzel and crew, but what they should have shown was the 1st South Carolina Volunteers of African descent. They were the ones who could have matched the white units any day. The commander, James Montgomery, a Jayhawker, he formed the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers of African Descent. He was more of a, in fact, Harriet Tubman liked him a lot better because he was more of a bushwhacker type guy. He did not insist on military discipline, et cetera. And so I think it was pretty much the same clay, the same raw material, but I think it was a reflection of the unit's commander and how the second, I don't know if it was exactly as bad. I don't know if the movie guys were trying to make a point as that, but they definitely were not of the same caliber as the first.
You know, Napoleon said that there are no bad regiments, there are only bad colonels. And I think this story and the question highlights that. It really is about leadership.
Do you have an estimate of the number of soldiers that initially enlisted in the First South who served the full length of the war? Or did they suffer high casualties, and did they engage in major battles?
Yeah. So there was a lay preacher in April named Abraham Murchison, and of course there's almost next to no information. You get this as a whiff of smoke, and you say, "Boy, there is something here." But he's the one who got the first. He explained the situation, and they got multiple volunteers, and of course they had to filter out the young boys and the old men. You guys about my age, they filtered them out. But that's where the original 150 steely-eyed guys that say we are fully informed of what the situation is and we want to go in. Company A, and so throughout the summer, you can imagine, Edward Pierce, the Treasury guy. Meanwhile, so what we're not talking about is the rest of the Port Royal experiment, because remember, Edward Pierce would have been competing for the same strong male labor to run all the plantations that he was running his experiment with. And here's the difference is he could offer them wages. And so a lot of the troops, what we didn't get into is that during the month of June and July, because General Hunter could not pay these guys, a lot of them started atrophying away, and he didn't enforce discipline because he couldn't pay them. And so that's part of the reason why the First South atrophied during the month of July, and why he disbanded them in August is because he couldn't pay them. But the core, if you look to Company A, and you will see, so out of that 150, that operational deployment in November that Colonel Beard took them on, that primarily was Company A, and that was it was down to about 64 guys that went on that deployment, and they are the inner circle, the core of the core, of which the regiment was formed upon. And of course, once they reformed the regiment in October, they brought a lot of the rest of the soldiers who went on for wages, because they had to look out for their families too. A lot of them stepped forward now that they could get wages, and they returned to the regiment. But it's that core of Company A that is the heart of this thing.
Okay. I'm going to sort of cut us off here. I just want to let you know that in addition to the questions which I can furnish you, and then you can answer at the end of ones we haven't gotten to, a number of the folks commented on how pleased they were with this presentation. Chris, some of the folks in Beaufort are singing your praises. And I got one comment that I'd like to talk to you later on. They say the Mellon Foundation is looking for stories that need to be told. And this person's comment was, this might be one of those stories that needs to be told. So maybe we can spur you along and help you write that book that you didn't know you were going to be tasked to write. It's no good deed goes unpunished. But no, folks are really pleased. I'll send you the rest of the questions so you can answer them. But I want to thank you for a engaging talk. You had a great audience tonight. It's been one of the largest ones we've had over the past couple months. So your topic resonated across the country, because you'll see where people come from. So thank you for you two. Any closing comments?
Just from here, I'll leave the big comments to the general. That's where wisdom will come from. But I just say that I am humbled by this story. I'm humbled by these soldiers, and that's where it's like They are the heroes in this, and I'd like to find out. There are more Prince Rivers out there, and I'd like to find them and get their stories out. But every time I see the Emancipation Proclamation, I choke up over it. So anyway, Benny, over to you.
General Hodges, when you make a comment, would you talk about how this story might be important for leaders today and for our Army today?
Well, I actually was not going to say anything because I think what Chris said was so beautiful. But I would like to see West Point and other officer producing institutions, ROTC programs, and frankly, any institution that's responsible for producing young leaders, women and men who are going to lead anything. These are some great examples of moral courage by a handful of white officers when they really were having to exploit some seams in the law, using their initiative like General Hunter did. And also, obviously, the incredible courage, physical and moral courage of these formerly enslaved people who knew that if they were ever captured, they were going to be executed immediately. And their white officers knew that they were going to be hung immediately if they were ever captured. So just the moral courage and the physical courage, there should be case studies about this. And then, frankly, from a strategic level, again, Chris and I, we had no idea about this part of the Civil War, not just the First South, but the role of Beaufort and this Union enclave. And I always considered myself a little bit of a Civil War nerd. I wasn't even aware of it, and really completely changed my perception of the operational design of Sherman's march to the sea and what our great U.S. Army was doing to win the war and save the Union.
Thank you for this presentation. Again, folks, we will be posting this up on YouTube over the next couple days. I would ask you let your friends know about this. We'll send you the links and we get this story more widely distributed over the next couple months. So again, good night. It's fairly late for you, General Hodges, I guess. It must be a little bit after midnight in Germany. Chris, you're on the East Coast, so we got hours left. So again, thank you much and talk to you soon.
Beat Navy.